Welcome into the Locked On Knicks podcast. Today, I'm joined by Yahoo Sports Dan Devine to answer one very simple question. Is Mikal Bridges good enough to elevate the Knicks to genuine title contention?
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's up, guys? You are Locked On Knicks, and I wanted to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. The sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I want to thank you for making Locked On Knicks your first listen today and every day. Today's another one of those days where it's going to have to be your second listen every day. That's right. This is going to be a two-parter with Dan. Remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode when we decide to do two of them. And be sure to hit that auto download function on your favorite podcast platform of choice. And please, if you get a chance, head over to iTunes, write us a 5-star review. It helps promote the podcast. And every time it happens, it makes my day. You can even write something funny in the comments. It doesn't have to be super serious. But who's shilling for subs? I'm Gavin Schall, your favorite play-by-play broadcaster's favorite play-by-play broadcaster. Today, as mentioned, Dan Devine, Yahoo Sports. I've had him on 3 times now, and it's probably 3 of my 10 favorite episodes we've done on the show. And Alex and I have done probably about 1,300, 1,200 at this point, something like that. So that is really saying something. It's kind of like, in the Avengers where they call Thor back to Earth, you pull someone out of retirement. That's always what it feels like for me. It's like, all right, big Knicks moment. I'm going to bring in the biggest guns we have, and that is Dan Devine. The guy is excellent, and this is a big-time conversation here in part 1. Going over the kind of player Mikal Bridges has to be for this trade to pay off for the New York Knicks, what the value is like, who else was out there. And we get into Isaiah Hartenstein a little bit. We're going to dive even deeper into that in part 2, when we're recording Monday morning is actually when we got the news that Hartenstein had officially left. For now, let's talk Mikal Bridges right here on Locked On Knicks. All right, guys, as promised, lucky enough to be joined by my buddy Dan Devine of Yahoo Sports and the No Cap Room podcast with Jake Fisher. Dan, thank you so much for coming on. Cool time in Knicks world. Maybe a little bit of a scary time in Knicks world. We're now on day 2 of Isaiah Hartenstein watch. I was really planning when we booked this pod, I was like, all right, there'll be summer. We can either panic, we could celebrate. We don't get to do either. We're in a state of waiting still, but happy to wait with you, buddy. How's it going?
Oh, I'm doing well. I mean, that is a state I feel pretty comfortable doing, like straddling the line between enjoyment and sheer terror. Like that's where I feel like I live, in that middle ground. So it's good to be there with you today.
You know what? I did not do enough research because I feel like there's probably a really fun, evocative German word for that state. And I didn't
call it Hartenstein. I mean, it's fine by me. Like it might as well.
It probably sounds even more painful than that, but we'll save that. I'll add a note in editing, but he's not here. Mikal Bridges is here, and that is really exciting. If you are a New York Knicks fan, I found myself since the night of the trade, I was extremely optimistic. Like you just heard from all these people, mostly not Knicks fans, maybe not clouding on the Knicks, but I think even really smart people are kind of going online and saying, all right, you know what, this was probably a little bit of an overpay. And I was like, no, you have to look at the context, like the fact that this was, and I said this on yesterday's pod, but I think I'm going to keep saying it all summer. Like this was the one way the Knicks could keep the identity they found that was so potent and so clearly, like there was magic there. Like I don't know how anyone could watch that playoff run and say, even though this team was cursed, there was also magic there in a really good way. And there was so much more than the sum of their parts. And Bridges, inherently having played with all these guys so long, even if he had never played with any of these guys, I think just with the type of player he is, the type of person he is, how reliable he is, and the versatility inherent to his game, you were keeping everything that made you so great and making it even better. And it's hard to argue with that because this is, again, like on the precipice of clearly being the most beloved Knicks team in 30 years. Maybe it's going to be 50 years when it's all said and done. And yet you see the Celtics say, all right, we're just going to run it back. Come at us. You see the Sixers go out and get Paul George last night while bringing in Eric Gordon, while somehow keeping Kelly Oubre, who tortured Jalen Brunson on a ridiculously cheap number. And you just kind of start like sweating a little bit. You're like, all right, that was the move, and now maybe you're losing Hartenstein. Where does that leave the Knicks? But before we even get into that, like what were your thoughts on the trade and whether or not it was an overpay, and maybe even more importantly, like what's the opportunity cost of Bridges being your all-in move?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much swirling around your brain when something like that happens, right? I mean, my first thought, just candidly, is like, do I have to write? And then I found out I don't have to write. I was like, okay, cool, all right, I can just kind of like think about this. I don't have to write right now. And I mean, I think like a lot of people, there was the initial sticker shock of just like that's a lot of picks. And then quickly kind of zooming to, well, what does that mean does this mean Anunoby's out the door because is he sort of coming in as a replacement for that slot? Oh, what does that mean for Hartenstein's free agency and how things work in the financial structure? Then sort of quickly moving from that to, no, this is like what you do when you have OG coming back. Like if this is the kind of move where you double down on what you've been doing. So then I felt fairly confident on, okay, well, this is a step toward now you have those two guys on the wing. And it's going to be tight making the money work for Hartenstein, which had always been the case because, as we've known from a bunch of people reporting, including my colleague Jake Fisher, Hartenstein was kind of always going to be the belle of the ball in the center market this summer. So it's like if someone wanted to go over the top for him, which still may be the case, that was always going to be tricky. But that was probably going to be true no matter what. So what can you do in the meantime? And in the meantime, you go and you add an excellent 3-and-D wing, somebody who plays a ton of minutes all the time, is obviously a perfect cultural fit with your existent core, and feels like somebody who can make sense whether the Knicks do play sort of the more traditional style that they had last year with Julius Randle in the starting lineup, or if when they didn't have Randle and they bumped OG up to the 4 and they played more wings. Like he fits in multiple ways, and it did make me think a little bit of Boston, not just in we're lining up the roster to be able to better equipped to handle Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum and, all the wings they've got there, matching size with size, etc. But more that the Celtics were a team where that top 6 kind of no matter what configuration of that group is on the floor can fit and make sense. So like if Porzingis is there, great. You can play one big. If you can play Porzingis with Al Horford, you can play Horford at the 5 and Porzingis off the floor. In rare occasions, it didn't work out so hot for them, but they tried like Tatum at the 5 and got more of the guards on the floor. They just, as long as you had 5 of those 6 guys, you felt pretty good. And then you start looking at it and thinking, all right, well, you come back into the next season with Brunson and Randall and OG and Bridges and Hart and Mitch or Hartenstein or both, and Dante DiVincenzo, like. You kind of are back in that mix of any of those 5 guys on the floor together feels like it makes sense, right? And, what did we see not this past year with the Celtics, but the year before also with Denver? They were a team that was super reliant on its top 6, basically, when you got to the playoffs. Obviously, the Knicks were a team that was super reliant on their top 6 in the playoffs by virtue of attrition and just, the gods being against you and saying eventually you're down to your top 4 and we'll figure it out from there. But you present you give yourself the best chance with that group of 5 or 6, maybe 7, maybe 8 at the high end of your rotation. It was a way that the Knicks could get better right away. And even if the cost was dear in terms of picks, as you mentioned, then you have to do the Charlie Kelly at the whiteboard, zoom out and start putting all the strings together and go. I
made the same analogy the night of. So.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're actually, it's not just 5 picks for Bridges. It's like 5 picks and Quickly and RJ for OG and Bridges. And really, when you think about it, it's only like a little bit more than you would have given up just for Donovan Mitchell. So ultimately, you're getting 2 guys in the door who are perfect fits, who are better next to Brunson, and you start doing all the cope in your head. And so the question is just going to be like, is that cope? Is that like you making amends with yourself to make, to be okay with the cost going out? And I think that I think it was worth the swing, worth the cost. The bet is the Mikal Bridges you saw last year in Brooklyn is not the Mikal Bridges you're going to see here, because he was playing with basically no point guard play. He was a primary ball handler, somebody who had to do much more of the shot creation. That is not going to be his role on this team. I think the efficiency numbers, you would expect them to perk back up toward where they were when he was in Phoenix, playing off of multiple other creators, but also now having spent 2 years stretching his game to the point where he could take on more on-ball duty, when Brunson hits the bench. And hopefully now you have multiple guys who could be a little bit more of a shot creator, have a little bit more in terms of running the offense in their game, where the offense just doesn't fall off a cliff when Jalen Brunson needs a rest. So to me, like, I mean, that's a lot of thoughts all swirling around in your brain. And then where it leads you to ultimately, obviously, is what does this mean for Isaiah Hartenstein? And the point that you made, this is like Bridges coming in is the Knicks doubling down on an identity. I think the fulcrum for me there is what has been the Knicks' identity since Tom Thibodeau took over. It's rim protection all 48 minutes. It's two bigs at almost all times. It's offensive rebounding. Like the size at the center position is so central to who the Knicks have been. And so now it makes you wonder, is this an inflection point where, yes, you obviously are going to want to be able to have at least one of those two bigs back. Ideally, I think the goal is everybody back plus Bridges, and then you go from there. But if you can't make it work that way, is this just a sort of an acknowledgement of we're going to need to be more comfortable playing one big four wing. We're going to have to be more comfortable playing small ball off the bench if we need to. And I wonder how comfortable Tibbs is with that. But that bringing in a big piece like Bridges feels like it might move you in a direction. And then if Hartenstein doesn't come back, might even move you in that direction even more.
All right, guys, we'll be back with Dan in just a sec on Locked On Knicks. We're getting to some of the alternate futures. What are the other paths the Knicks could have gone down? Was there a better path than giving up so many picks for Mikal Bridges? We talk about that next on Locked On Knicks. But first, I wanted to tell you about our good friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. They're selling for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. Seriously, if you want to maximize it, put some money down early on the New York Knicks to win a championship. They have plus 900 odds. It'll carry you throughout the year. You think you're living and dying with this team now, just wait until you have some monetary investment. You can do that by going over to FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Yeah, I think to your point, maybe I should rephrase that. It's more of a cultural double down than a stylistic double down,
right?
Because this is what we were getting into on the show last night, and this it sounds weird to say because I think Hartenstein is exceptional, but the only silver lining I see in him leaving is that it could, like, especially with like all the backup centers getting snatched up. We reports this morning. We'll wrap up the show. This is like Goga Bitadze might get an offer from Orlando that the Knicks might put the Knicks out of reach for him to be the backup center there, with them presumably trading Wendell Carter and maybe signing Hartenstein. Jalen Smith somehow got 3 for $27 million. Like, he was a guy like I wanted to ask you about. I was excited saying, all right, well, maybe you can like turn this into a stretch 5. Nope. He's off the board. And I wonder if Tom Thibodeau, as he was like during game 4 of the Sixers series, and it looked really good, is pushed into a corner where you might have to put out a Jalen Brunson, Dante DiVincenzo, Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, Julius Randle lineup, like against the Boston Celtics, or like in closing minutes against the Sixers. And to me, far from, and this is something, again, we can circle back on, far from that being the end of the world, like I think that is probably their only chance of being a team like Boston without Isaiah Hartenstein, because I think with Mitchell Robinson out there, and on top of that, like, you're losing a lot of spacing at the center spot with him in lieu of Hartenstein. You're inherently losing spacing going from Bridges to DiVincenzo, even though Bridges is an excellent shooter, borderline elite. DiVincenzo is now a top 5 shooter in the league, and just in terms of volume, range, where he's positioned on the court, like it is just a different animal. And that is maybe the one way you get best of both worlds, even if I don't see Tibbs leaning into that all regular season. And that might be a good thing if you're trying to preserve OG Anunoby. But before we get into those best lineups, I guess I just wanted to get your feel, just looking at the superstar landscape around the league, and also the cap landscape and how locked in the Knicks were going to be. Like, to me, like, before we just put a pin in the Bridges conversation, like, I guess I just want to do that one more time. And maybe it's just out of nostalgia, because on this podcast, we spent 5 years being like, all right, is Devin Booker going to become available?
Sure.
Last summer, there was a fun week where it was like, oh, Giannis, like, could be out of town. Like, and maybe still could be a year from now. Paul George was an episode we did like 3 days before they traded for Bridges. Kawhi Leonard, like, who knows how that turns out. And maybe outside of Giannis and of course, like, Booker, I don't really see being dealt the next few years, but you just never know. And by doing this move now, you took yourself out of that conversation for, I think the way Zach Lowe put it, like a higher wattage star, and someone who, like, maybe does change things culturally a little bit, maybe does change things stylistically a little bit, but maybe would have given you a higher ceiling as a team. And doing like a similarly themed episode yesterday, that's sort of what we got caught up on. Like, all right, if you trade for Paul George instead of Mikal Bridges, you're giving up less stuff. You're trading for someone who is way more injury prone, way less likely to actually be there when you're trying to play for a championship. Way less likely to have the longevity of someone than Bridges, but maybe just gives you a better shot at beating the Celtics the next 2 years. And that's sort of what I focused on. Like are the Knicks, and it kind of gets to the core. Like if I had a Knick, if the Knicks were a high school student, like my biggest insecurity would be like, all right, like, is all this just cute at the end of the day? Like, is it enough? Like, even if the Knicks were healthy last year, could they have beaten the Celtics, or did they actually need, on top of Jalen Brunson, who's clearly proven to be that, like another top 15 to 20 player, when guys like Bridges, you look at his playoff track record, you look at Julius Randle's playoff track record or lack thereof, like there was one guy who as a scorer has gotten it done in the big way, in a big way in the playoffs on this roster, and that's Jalen Brunson, and teams traditionally don't win a championship with just one of those guys.
These are all reasonable questions. And I mean, my snap judgment thought when the Bridges trade happened was, I don't think that's changing my pick in a Celtics-Knicks series on its face, right? Like, both rosters on paper assume full health. I probably would still take Boston in that series. It is rarely the case that when you get to April and then especially May and then especially into June, that exactly the way things looked on paper in July is the way they're going to look at that point. So, I mean, as one example, like since the Bridges trade happened, we know that Kristaps Porzingis is undergoing surgery and is not going to be back for 6 months, right? 5 or 6 months. And so like that is the beginning of the season, right? That's into the, Christmas or maybe, thereabouts. So like, who knows if the way the Celtics operate is exactly the same way by the time they get to the postseason? Who knows if it puts additional strain on somebody else? And then, the downstream effects of what it takes to, withstand some of that. Obviously, the Sixers, you look at it and say, Paul George on paper, absolutely perfect fit between Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. I say this not, to be rude to any Sixers fans who might be listening, but like, how often do things go according to plan on paper in terms of health and availability and everything else for the Philadelphia 76ers, right?
Dan, feel free to be rude for them. This podcast is a safe space for that. Go ahead.
No, but it's just, I think everybody, like, what's the right way to sort of phrase this? I understand if your response to a move like the Sixers getting Paul George or the Knicks trading for Mikal Bridges is like, yeah, but like it doesn't ultimately change everything at the highest level. And I don't think that teams can think like that. I think they have to think, what can we do to get better? Like, what really can we do? And when you think about that list of top 10, top 15 guys and all, who you stockpile your picks and your assets and your tradable salaries for, and you go down the list of like, well, who's really going to be available? And it's not, Giannis signed, re-ups in Milwaukee, Luka re-ups in Dallas, they make the finals. You go down, Booker. Yeah. I mean, but Booker is a very good player, but Booker's probably closer to 10 to 15 than he is to 1. Right. Yeah. And so like, as you go down the list, like obviously Tatum just won the championship. He's not going anywhere. Brown, even if he's not in your top 15, he just won the championship. He's not going anywhere. You sort of start ticking names off. And so then you're trying to make adjustments in your head where you're like, Embiid, they just, they re-upped Paul, they bring in Paul George, they re-up Maxey, he's on a max and he might even further extend off of that. Like, as you go down the list, who's really available? Jokic is not going anywhere. Like, so if you're holding out hope for that tier, that all NBA first team tier of guys, and there's none of them available, you start then going like, all right, is it Karl Anthony Towns? And I think we've had many conversations and all over the course of the last few years, like, is that really, like, how much is that moving the needle, right? And on a pure talent play, like, yeah, he's a more talented player than Mikal Bridges, but he brings his own concerns as far as what you would be on the defensive end and where you would be in a cultural fit. And if you're bringing in somebody on like a $55 million contract, that person operates with a certain sort of primacy within the organization and in the structure that you've got. Like, is that really where you want to be going? So all of that sort of broader consideration, like, brings me to the point of maybe you did, like, yes, there's no argument to be made that Mikal Bridges is like a more impactful signing than insert all NBA first team player here. But I think the bets that are made, which is that contract, that the structural fit, the versatility that he provides with you on both ends of the floor, the rising tide lifts all boats component of, we've seen, we know these guys can play together. There is an inherent chemistry here. And we know that the style that we got to, we feel really good about this. To me, it indicates the Knicks feel like what they saw last year was real and not some kind of like, we caught lightning in a bottle and Brunson's never going to be that good again. And none of these guys are ever going to be that good again. It indicates to me that they feel like the style they found both in that, 14 game sample with Randall on, and OG healthy at the same time. And then after that, when OG came back, both of those feel real. So it maybe caps you at in terms of like if everybody else is healthy, all of the number one guys on every other team are available and their supporting cast are all healthy and all available. Maybe you don't quite have the same firepower that they do. But I think that the Knicks front office is looking at it and saying, this gives us a really good chance of being like at a floor, I don't know what, like top 7 on both ends of the floor. And it from a rotational standpoint, obviously the Hartenstein question is the biggest one, but if you take last year's rotation and move out Bojan Bogdanovic and move in Mikal Bridges, yes, there are downstream effects from that in terms of who starts and who doesn't and who's on the floor and yada, yada, yada. But that gives us a chance to be not just like a 50-win team with an outside shot, but like maybe a 55-win team with a significantly better shot. And in an atmosphere where windows only open for like 2 years at a time, contract lengths are getting shorter, the league is accelerating and churning. You're not seeing teams build dynasties. You're barely seeing teams stay together for a half dozen years or 5 years. It gives you a better chance of being at that high ebb now or high peak now. And so I think that's kind of all you can do. And you got to get, just hope for the best, do everything you can to get both higher up in the seeding and then to April, May, and June healthy, and then let the chips fall where they may from there.
I think it tells you a lot about how teams think about the Boston Celtics in some ways, because I look back to those Kevin Durant Warriors team, and there was this feeling around the league, just, all right, we're punting the next 3 years because we're not going to beat those guys. And the Rockets were the lone exception to that, but everyone else was just sort of like, all right, there's not really any point. Let's get as many asses as we can. Let's go into a long hibernation. We'll come out.
It's a great point, but like we remember that Rockets team as a failure because they missed 27 straight 3-pointers in game 7, right? Yeah. But they were up 3-2 on that Warriors team and had 2 shots to take them out. It's fair. You can say that is a blown opportunity. You can say that is a team that was a failure, but in terms of construction and presentation and opportunity, they got there. And if not, maybe for a Chris Paul pulled hamstring and a world historic cold streak in shooting, they toppled the team that people were punting to get away from. So all you can do is try to build the best team you can with what you've got. And I think even though Bridges is not at the same wattage as, that era of Chris Paul or whatever, right? I think there's an argument to be made that this is the Knicks doing that, and that they believe that the sort of harmonic convergence of this guy in this culture, in this system, and this level of versatility, and what it allows us to do in terms of shooting and length, positional size, the way we can invert matchups, all sorts of stuff, that those things can be like together powerful enough to get you at least into the conversation with teams that might have an across the board talent advantage at some of those positions.
I'm going to steal harmonic convergence. That's a good way.
By all means, please do.
Some of the matches, well phrased. Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting. Like that is a lesson that you just sort of have to go for it, and maybe not quite to the same extent, because the guy won an MVP and was putting up like 37 points a game. But the same way the Rockets said, hey, this is the 3 years of James Harden's prime that we have. Like we just have to do this. Jalen Brunson, these last 2 postseasons, like he's looked like a borderline top 5 player in the league. And if you have that guy in his prime, like the Knicks, since those 70s teams, they've had like maybe Apex Bernard King, Patrick Ewing at his peak. Like they've had it twice in half the century, unless I'm maybe Melo in 2012-13 is the one other version of that. But it is really, really hard to get that guy. It is really, as the Knicks have seen a million times, shout out Wash Tracy McGrady. Like it's hard to find that guy at the right time and the right place. And if you have that, like you owe it to that dude to go all in, I think Bridges' salary is also clearly a factor in why the price was so high, because like when you talk about Bridges or Paul George, it wasn't Bridges or Paul George, it was Bridges and Randall or Paul George, versus like maybe a lot of picks you could have used to replace Randall in some ways. And that's a road you can go down if you want to, but you were not going to get another superstar without literally retaining the whole of this team. And that is why I think the Knicks ultimately decided this was the move. And I think in particular, if they have Hartenstein, and again, like I think the Celtics are maybe like one iota below that Warriors team in terms of pure inevitability, just because Steph and KD were just better than Jason Tatum by like a couple of notches, I think, even though I'd say the Celtics as like a starting five that just fits together. Like I guess you could say that Warriors death lineup, like I think it is as well constructed of a team. And I'm still just angry that they got picks to take on Kristaps Porzingis. Like that's what turned them into the Death Star. And like that guy just walked into their building. Drew Holiday, Derek White on reasonable salaries, just sort of walked into that building. So give Brad Stevens credit. Like I think it is hard from a building perspective to match what the Celtics did, because it was all just seamless and they didn't have to. They have more picks than the Knicks, getting all five of those guys in than the Knicks did just essentially bringing in Bridges. So as much as I hate to say, credit to the Celtics, credit to the Sixers, because to your point, on paper, they look amazing too. But this was just something the Knicks ultimately had to do. And that being said, like I would not give them below like a 30% chance of winning that series. And if you have like maybe not a coin flip, but like a coin that's only slightly weighted one side against you, like you just have to do it. You just have to go in. You started getting into this a little bit, but I want to go a little deeper. Like how, this is an arbitrary question, but how good does Bridges have to be for the Knicks to win maybe two series, maybe three series like that, if you go Sixers, Celtics, and then whoever the best team in the West is? Because I'm still sort of wondering what the best version of him is. Because on the Suns, like I went back and looked the other day, the efficiency numbers were just ridiculous. Like I think there was a season where he was something like 74% at the rim while hitting nearly 40% of his threes, while finishing maybe this was a year or two later, but second in the NBA in all defense. And I think that is maybe even more so. Like I almost have very little doubt that he can, like, even if his athleticism is maybe dropped off a tad into his 20s, like that he's going to be really efficient offensively. Defensively, I thought, and just talking to Nets fans who watched him on a daily basis, like there was a discernible, like significant step back from those heights. And to me, the best version of this Knicks team features like two of the top 5 wing defenders on planet Earth. I have no doubts that Anunoby, as long as he's on the court, he's going to be there. Do you think Bridges still has that in him? And we saw that stretch when he was initially on the Nets offensively, where he did look like someone who was going to make a couple of all-star teams. And now we're all kind of looking at him and saying, all right, that guy's not there. Like the truth is somewhere in the middle. Like, is there a higher end version where, like in a game where Jalen doesn't have it, or Kelly Oubre is inexplicably locking him up? Like, and Julius, again, a big question mark coming into the playoffs. Like, can Bridges be that bona fide 2, maybe just for a game or so, like 1 against one of the best teams in the NBA? All right, guys, that is it for part 1 with Dan. In part 2, we're going to get more into Mikal Bridges and what player he has to become to help lead the Knicks to a title. And yes, we address the breaking news on Isaiah Hartenstein, how the Knicks can rebound, and Julius Randle. What's his role in all this? How can the Knicks best maximize him? How can he best maximize the Knicks? We get into all that and more later on Locked On Knicks.